This is a climate change with Matt Matern, but I am filling in for Matt Matern. My name is Harry Berberian, and we have an amazing guest today on a climate change. We have Professor Michael Mann, and he is the director of the Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media at University of Pennsylvania. And I was very curious, Michael, first of all, about what exactly is, tell us about the Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media, because the word media, I just was intrigued by, and what's that all about, and welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks, Harry. It's good to be with you. And this center, which I started when I arrived at the University of Pennsylvania just last September, after having been at Penn State University for 16 years. And so the joke is that I didn't have to get new business cards. I just crossed off the state, and I can still use them. So I'm now at Penn rather than Penn State. And one of the attractions was not just that, there are a lot of great folks in climate science at the University of Pennsylvania. In my department, the Department of Earth and Environmental Science, there's important climate research that goes on there, and I'm part of that now. But what I was also intrigued by was the presence of the Annenberg School for Communication, one of the leading schools for communication in the country. And sort of over the years, while I started out really as a scientist, my experiences sort of pushed me out into the public sphere. And over time, I've really embraced that opportunity to not just do science related to climate change, but to inform the public discourse and the often fractious public debate over climate change and what to do about it. And so at Penn, I had an opportunity to have a joint appointment in arts and sciences, but also the Annenberg School, where I direct this center that tries to bring all that together, that brings together the science and its implications and what it tells us about, climate risk and the sorts of impacts that we may have to contend with. But the greatest challenge really today isn't so much the scientific case. We know enough about the science to tell us that climate change is real, it's human caused, and it's already creating all sorts of problems for us. The real challenge now is communicating that to the public and to policymakers in a way that's accessible and, frankly, in an environment that's sometimes hostile, because there are some bad actors out there that have really been working hard to pollute our public discourse with misinformation and indeed disinformation, intentional misinformation that is aimed at sort of, creating doubt about the science and thus sort of promoting an agenda of inaction, of climate inaction, because if we fail to do anything about the problem, the big winner there is the fossil fuel industry that would love us to sort of follow a pathway of business as usual, that would love us to remain addicted to fossil fuels when in fact we know we have to get off that addiction. And so that's really the challenge now, is to communicate not just the urgency, but also the agency, the fact that we can still make a difference in this very fractious, public sort of political economy that we find ourselves in today when it comes to issues like climate change.
Right. But I mean, how do we truly, though? Is it true then? Let's say the right wingers out there denying climate change and whatnot. Truly, the fossil fuel industry is behind all this dissemination of incorrect information, and it seems to be like a monolith of just almost people that, I don't know. Is it wrong of me to say that I feel that people that are not alarmed about climate change think that God or something is going to save the day, and that there's nothing to worry about, and no matter what we do to this earth, is that tied in also with the fossil fuel industries, that line of thinking?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and and it's something that I get into a bit in my book. My sort of one of my first books was the hockey stick and the climate wars, was sort of about my experiences as a scientist, finding myself in this very contentious arena of the public discourse over this issue. So yeah, the fossil fuel industry, ExxonMobil, other large fossil fuel companies for decades have funded a massive misinformation campaign. And in fact, some years ago, the journalistic outlet Inside Climate News, small outfit, but they actually have won a Pulitzer Prize for their reporting, and they're very focused on the issue of climate. And they did sort of an investigation into a report. It was an ExxonMobil internal report from 1982 that got leaked into the public domain. And in this report, ExxonMobil's own scientists were describing the potential consequences of continued fossil fuel burning as catastrophic. Those are their words. Those are the words of ExxonMobil's own scientists. But they fired that division. They got rid of it. They hid that report and instead invested literally hundreds of millions of dollars in a massive misinformation campaign, along with other fossil fuel companies, to attack the very science that their own scientists had secretly reaffirmed themselves. In some ways, it's comparable to what the tobacco industry did, hiding, their own internal research that demonstrated the threat of their product. In that case, cigarettes, tobacco. And it's interesting that you draw this analogy sort of with religion, and the idea that, hey, God will save us. There is, and I hate to use forgive the pun here, but there is this sort of unholy alliance that has formed over time between what we might think of as the corporate right, tobacco industry, fossil fuel industry, and the religious right. And I've talked a bit about that in some of my writings, and other, scholars have talked about that at length. And it has to do with the fact that there was this political alliance that sort of the corporate right needed to convince hordes of people to support their agenda. Hordes of people whose own interests conflict with the interests potentially of powerful corporations. And that has been one of the great successes, really, on the right side of our political spectrum, has been for one of the two parties to marshal a fairly sizable contingent of people to vote against their own interest. And that's true when it comes to things like climate change. But religion turned out to be a very important part of that. The use of religion as a way to sort of marshal, if you will, sort of the ground forces in this movement, and that that alliance, people like Ralph Reed of the Christian Coalition, some years ago, that was decades ago, where he was caught on tape, sort of talking about how clever they were in convincing Christian, large numbers of evangelicals to support their anti-tax, pro-corporation agenda. So it's interesting that you say that, that you draw that analogy, because there is this sort of, and you see it on social media, right? You see that there is, when you look at people who sort of brandish themselves as MAGA Republicans, and they're almost always climate change deniers, and you look at their profiles, they'll often say, like, God, Jesus, guns. This is part of the ideology now. It is, and it's and it has created a real obstacle when it comes to things that are about facts, not opinions, and not about ideology. Climate change is a fact. It doesn't care. It doesn't care about your politics. The impacts of climate change don't care about your politics. The ocean doesn't care whether you're Republican or a Democrat, as it inundates your communities. Tropical, storms, hurricanes, these increasingly more damaging storms and droughts and heat waves and wildfires and floods, they impact all of us. They don't care about our party affiliation. a good friend of mine and one of the great scientists in our field, Lonnie Thompson, who was a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Science, used to say, because he did a lot of research into glaciers and the melting of glaciers, and he would say the ice has no agenda as it melts. And that's true of the climate writ large. And so that's the challenge, right? In this very polarized information age that we can, that we exist in today, where social media like Twitter have become weaponized, ideologically to advance certain agendas, it's really difficult to have a conversation about something like climate change, which has become, again, it's been weaponized, it's been politicized, not by the scientists. The critics like to say, oh, you guys politicize the science. No, we're just trying to deliver the message of what the science has to say. That message happens to be convenient for some powerful interests. And that's why it's become political, because it's become inconvenient to some powerful interests.
Gotcha. All right, we're going to wrap here with the first segment. You're listening to A Climate Change with Matt Matern. We have the distinguished professor Michael Mann, and we'll be right back. You're listening to A Climate Change with Matt Matern, and we have, again, the distinguished professor Michael Mann from the University of Pennsylvania. And as we were saying, Michael, we were talking, obviously about like the dissemination campaign from the fossil fuel industry, but I mean, let's say, corporations are truly, throttling our governments out there around the world. And if government is going to be a major agency in combating climate change, what do we do about the fossil fuel industry having such a grip on our political institutions? What do we do about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And just today, there was an announcement, the Supreme Court has gutted parts of the Clean Water Act. So we're sort of watching this play out. We're seeing a dismantling of many of the critical, environmental successes that came about. I would, point out, not just from Democratic administrations, but Republican administrations. Let's not forget that Richard Nixon, the Nixon administration, gave us the EPA in the first place. Ronald Reagan supported the Montreal Protocol to ban, ozone depleting chemicals. George H.W. Bush actually was instrumental. His administration actually produced the notion of cap and trade. That was a Republican concept that came about under the George H.W. Bush administration to deal with the problem of acid rain. And so, for a long time, issues of environmental preservation and conservation weren't political. And when you think about it, if you're a conservative, well, shouldn't it be natural to want to conserve, our environment? And it was only really in the administration of the second George Bush, George W. Bush, where issues like climate change really started to become such a politically partisan issue. And that came about in part because of efforts of Dick Cheney and the energy industry. And they sort of came in midway through George W. Bush's first term. Actually, W supported, climate action. He appointed Christine Todd Whitman, who was an environmentalist, to be the head of the EPA. And she declared CO2 emissions, carbon emissions from fossil fuels, to be a pollutant under the Clean Air Act. That was under George W. Bush's administration. Midway through the administration, though, it was really Dick Cheney and the energy industry that came in. They got rid of Christine Todd Whitman. They took over the environmental policy, essentially, of that administration. And they haven't looked back. And so since then, it really has become a politically partisan issue. And that's really unfortunate. Now, there are some conservatives out there. Some of them are good friends of mine who are true political conservatives. They have conservative ideologies, but they care about the planet that they leave behind for their children and grandchildren. Bob Inglis, former congressman from South Carolina, who was sort of part of the so-called Reagan Revolution back in the 1980s, had a nearly perfect lifetime conservative voting record. But his children actually convinced him that he needed to do something about climate. He's an evangelical Christian, cares about stewardship of the planet, and started talking about climate. And then the good old Koch brothers, conservative funders, came in and basically booted him. They primaried him out of his congressional position by giving lots of money to a primary opponent who defeated him in that election. And so there are some good folks out there who are Republicans, but they've increasingly found themselves somewhat isolated in a party that has formed a very close association with the fossil fuel industry. And that's sort of where we are now. Let me come back to your original question, because I didn't even answer it. What can we do?
It's still fascinating. You're elaborating on the earlier section, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, so what can we do about it? So, in the end, the obstacles aren't technological at this point. They're not physical. We can still act to avert the worst consequences of climate change. The obstacles are political. And that means we can make a difference through our action, through voting, through using our voice, through doing everything in our power, in our means, to put pressure on the political process and to help elect politicians. And I don't care what party affiliation they are, as long as they support action on climate, putting those people in politics and getting rid of those who refuse to act, who have instead hindered efforts to do something about climate, who have acted essentially as rubber stamps for polluters. We got to get rid of them. We got to vote in people who will do our bidding, what's right for us, rather than the bidding of powerful polluters.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so politics is truly a major force when it comes to addressing climate change. Do you think there, and I've heard that you're hopeful about combating climate change overall, are you not?
I am. Part of it comes from, studying the science, knowing what the science says, and it tells us that, there's still time to prevent, 3-degree Fahrenheit warming of the planet, where we'll start to see some of the worst consequences of climate change.
What would a 3-degree planet look like, an increase of 3 degrees?
Well, we start to potentially move into new territory where we see not just damage to coral reefs, but the destruction of all the world's great coral reefs. We see even more devastating hurricanes, and we've already seen the devastating consequences of extreme weather events that have been supercharged by the warming of the planet in the form of these unprecedented heat waves and wildfires and floods and droughts that we've seen in recent years here in the United States and elsewhere around the world. So by some measure, dangerous climate change consequences have already come here, but it gets a whole lot worse. And the climate projections show that if we warm the planet beyond 1.5 Celsius, that's about 3 degrees Fahrenheit. Right now, we're at about 1.2 Celsius. We warm it beyond 1.5, we'll start to see, qualitatively more devastating extreme weather events. We may commit to the collapse of large parts of the major ice sheets, the Greenland ice sheet, the West Antarctic ice sheet, where we're locking in not just inches or feet of sea level rise, but we're locking in meters of sea level rise, and the inundation ultimately of our great coastal cities. That there's some uncertainty, but uncertainty isn't our friend here. I like to look at it not so much as like a cliff that exists at 1.5 Celsius, 3 degrees Fahrenheit. It's more like we're walking out onto a minefield. And the farther we walk out onto that minefield, the more danger we're likely to encounter. And so the only smart, action at this point is to stop this forward lurch onto this dangerous climate minefield. And that's where the science, to me, is actually somewhat reassuring, because the developments in climate science over the last decade or so have actually led to a pretty substantial revision in our understanding of the relationship between carbon emissions and warming. we used to think that warming would persist for decades, even if we stopped polluting, because of what we call the thermal inertia of the system, the sluggishness of the oceans that continue to warm up even after we stop raising the concentrations of greenhouse gases. And that's true, that's real, but it's offset by another factor, which we weren't really taking into account, is that the oceans in particular are drawing down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So if we stop adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, the oceans, and to a lesser extent, what we call the terrestrial biosphere, forests and plants on land, they're pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. So that CO2 level starts to come down, and the warming effect of that CO2 starts to come down. And all of that sort of, in the end, cancels out. The delayed warming that I talked about at the beginning, the thermal inertia, which would cause us continue to warm after we stop polluting, is offset by this CO2 absorption effect. The two things cancel out, and we basically get a flat line. What do I mean by that? If we stopped polluting right now, global surface temperatures would basically stop warming up. They would stay at the level that they are right now. It would happen within a couple years, 2 to 3 years, the planet stops warming up. And so that means that there is a direct and immediate impact of our efforts to reduce carbon emissions. It really speaks to that agency that I was talking about before.
So if we just stop where we're at right now, we'll be okay.
And the planet stops warming up. The surface of our planet, which is driving these extreme weather events, stops warming up. Now, it's not that simple, because the oceans continue, the deep oceans continue to warm. The ice sheets continue to be sort of eroded as the ice shelves are warmed by the warm ocean beneath it. So sea level rise could actually continue on for some time. There are some impacts that could continue to get worse, but a lot of the impacts, those impacts that are tied directly to how warm the surface of the planet is, those would stop getting worse. So that's a really important finding. And, in reality, of course, it's hard to slam on the brakes. We have this locomotive, right? That is our global economic system. And we're not going to make that transition overnight. There's going to be a certain amount of delay there. So
I want to talk to you something about the oceans. We're going to wrap up this particular segment about the ocean's ability to absorb carbon. But you're listening to A Climate Change with Matt Matern. We have Professor Michael Mann, and we'll be right back. You're listening to A Climate Change with Matt Matern. I'm your substitute host today, Harry Barbarian, and we have the distinguished Professor Michael Mann. And Michael, continuing on with the subject of the oceans and how I've heard it, like the oceans, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but they absorb as much as, is it 80% of all the carbon dioxide ideally out there?
I'm going to give you, I just finished teaching a course for first-year students at Penn on climate, and I'm going to give you an A-. That was a good, you're very close. You get a lot of partial credit there, 90%, but you're right. A huge amount of the heating is going into the oceans. About 90% of the heat is going into the oceans.
That's amazing. But now we recently spoke to, do you know Professor Gaurav Sant?
It sounds familiar, but I'm not sure I know them well.
Yeah, he is leading a team of researchers that have developed carbon sequestration from the oceans. He's arguing that we have to remove carbon from the oceans because the oceans are much like a sponge, and they're over capacitated with carbon, and their ability to remove carbon is jeopardized because there's just too much carbon in the ocean, and that we have to remove the carbon to make the oceans more apt to soak in the carbon. What is your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's right. This is sort of the, climate change's evil twin, if you like, because the carbon pollution we're putting into the atmosphere is not just warming up the planet and creating climate change. It's also literally acidifying the ocean, because some of that atmospheric carbon, as we've already said, some of that CO2 is absorbed by the ocean. When it's dissolved in water, it forms carbonic acid that literally dissolves the calcium carbonate skeletons of shellfish. It dissolves coral reefs. So the ocean is literally getting more acidic. Now it's still basic, like it's got a pH that's higher than 7 than water, which is neutral. So it's still basic, but it's becoming less basic. It's becoming more acidic, and already it's become more difficult for these shellfish, for corals, to create these, calcium carbonate skeletons that they obviously need, and that's a real threat to ocean ecosystems. It's a threat to the food chains that support us, because obviously we are very dependent on seafood. 25%, I believe, of the population of the world, their primary source of protein is seafood. And so this is a threat to us as well, but it's a threat to our ecosystems. And so you're absolutely right. The CO2, there's no free lunch. As I said before, some of that CO2 that we're putting into the atmosphere, some of it's going to be absorbed by the oceans, but that's doing damage itself. So the only real way to to prevent all of this from getting worse is to stop the source of the problem, which is our ongoing burning of fossil fuels and the ongoing addition of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Again, a little bit of good news. We've got the technology to do it. We just need the political will. And it's a tall order. We've got to cut carbon emissions by 50% within the next decade if we are to keep warming below that sort of danger level that I talked about of 3 degrees Fahrenheit, 1.5 Celsius, but it's still doable.
Right. Okay. So let's just say, climate change, what's going on is it's dictated by, let's say, the almighty dollar. So everyone, if these corporations.
Well, first you said the almighty, and now you're saying the almighty dollar.
Well, you know what I mean? I mean, the power of economics is driving, obviously, climate change and the fossil fuels industry interest in continuing to promote fossil fuels. So do you feel that, in our changing automotive, mechanics of, using like electric or hydrogen or hybrids? I mean, and I see like corporations like Aramco and Exxon and whatever here and there, they're touting, new green energy solutions to, do you feel like there could be a huge new economic incentive to shift away from fossil fuels for these corporations? Because it seems like they're never gonna end their greedy, fascination with fossil fuels until there's a true economic, incentive to make themselves look good by now embracing green technologies. I mean, do you see that there's an economic incentive for them to, or is that structure truly not in place and it's not?
You're absolutely right, actually. In fact, the incentives right now are in the direction of renewable energy. If you look at the levelized cost of different forms of energy, and Lazard every year puts out updated estimates of so how much does it cost to produce a watt of power from different sources of energy, taking into account not just the cost of the energy production, but the upfront infrastructure you have to create. And obviously for a coal-fired power plant, you got to build that coal-fired power plant. For solar, you got to build those those solar arrays. So the levelized cost takes all that upfront money and then the marginal cost of producing a unit of power. And so what's the overall average cost for each source of energy? And renewable energy, wind, solar, geothermal, beats out fossil fuel energy. It beats out nuclear energy. Nuclear is quite expensive on that scale. And the only reason, so you at this point, I can see a puzzled look, and you should be puzzled. Well, if it's cheaper, then why aren't we all just moving in that direction, buying the cheaper energy? Well, the fossil fuel industry, and we talked about, the huge power and influence that they have, and they've used that power and influence to get all sorts of incentives, all sorts of government subsidies that make them artificially cheap. They're only able to outcompete renewable energy because they get all of these cheap leases to sort of drill for oil and natural gas on public lands, all sorts of incentives, direct and indirect, that make them artificially cheaper than they really are. And that's not even taking into account the damage, right? Because when we, burn fossil fuels, we're doing damage to all of us. We're doing damage to our economy. There's a real cost associated with the climate change, and that's not taken into account. That's not even part of the calculation. That's why we need a price on carbon, or permit, carbon, tradable emissions permits, or carbon pricing, or some way of internalizing the damage that burning of fossil fuels is doing to the planet. Because if we were to do that, then we would immediately transition. We'd transition even faster towards renewable energy.
But let's say these corporations are able to see, like, hey, there's we're tired of the backlash against our industry. We're going to switch to hydrogen. We're going to switch to, we're going to, even though there's ecological damage when it comes to mining for lithium batteries and whatnot, to our oceans and, to nodules and all that, and mines across the world. I mean, is it possible that, like, new cleaner sources of energy would be more potentially just as profitable, if not more profitable, than using fossil fuels?
Absolutely. And we're seeing companies that are coming in and going, in that direction, are doing very well. In fact, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was, the most significant climate legislation that's ever been signed into law by a president, contained sort of components of what's known as a clean power standard that provides incentives to utilities who provide a larger and larger fraction of their energy from renewable energy. So there are incentives there to help move them in that direction. But here's the problem. Those new companies that are coming in, there are incentives for them, and they're profitable, and they also create a whole lot more jobs, because the fossil fuel industry has largely become automated. So there just aren't that many jobs in coal, natural gas. There are a lot more potential jobs in renewable energy, building new renewable energy infrastructure, smart grid technology, storage. That's where the growth potential is. But the fossil fuel industry has a huge sunken investment. If we move away from fossil fuels, they've got, billions of dollars of fossil fuel reserves that are already on their sheets, that are already part of their proven reserves, and they want to monetize that. And they don't want anything to come in the way of them monetizing all of those fossil fuels, lest they become sunken, what are known as sunken assets.
Got it. So they already have a vested interest, invested over years of
exactly.
And
reserves, and huge amounts of reserves of fossil fuels that they want to drill, that they want to recover and sell. And we have to make sure that those become stranded assets.
Well, how do we, we're going to be wrapping up this segment, but very quickly, how do we ensure that they become stranded assets?
Market forces, if we guide them in the right direction, will make it too expensive. It'll be too expensive to drill that increasingly difficult to get to oil or coal, especially when you've got renewable energy companies coming in and providing cheaper energy from clean sources.
So somehow, if our governments can make it more expensive for these fossil fuel companies to operate successfully, then maybe there can be a true change. All right, we're wrapping up this one segment here. We're listening to A Climate Change with Matt Matern. I'm guest hosting Harry Berberian. We've got wonderful Professor Michael Mann, and we'll be right back. You're listening to A Climate Change with Matt Matern. I am your guest host, Harry Berberian, and we've got Professor Michael Mann. And we're continuing our discussion. But Michael, you have a brand new book coming out. It's just about to be released, I see, called Our Fragile Moment. And I know you've written a lot of books about the climate. And what is different about our fragile moment, and differing from all the other books about climate change out there? And tell us about Our Fragile Moment.
Yeah, thanks. So, my last book was The New Climate War, and it was really about the sort of the politics of climate and climate action and the obstacles that we face today as we move away from denial, because it's not tenable. It just isn't credible anymore. You still have some people out there, and Twitter, there's amplification of climate deniers. So you would think that there are a lot of them out there because of how amplified they are on certain social media like Twitter with their new algorithm. But the reality is there aren't a lot of climate deniers out there because we are all seeing the impacts of climate change playing out in real time. That doesn't mean the battle's over. We've moved away from denial, but we've moved on to sort of these other tactics that polluters are using because they don't care why, what prevents us from taking action. They just care that we don't take action. And so if they can't do that through denial, then they'll happily use other sort of tactics like deflection. We don't need policies. We don't need, legislation, carbon pricing, anything like that. We just need individuals to be better stewards of the environment. We need individuals to change their behavior voluntarily to decrease their carbon emissions. It's a classic tactic that we've seen used over and over in the past. The beverage industry did this. The tobacco industry has done this. Blame it on individuals to take the pressure off of politicians to pass legislation to solve the problem systemically. We're not going to solve this problem because individuals decide to change their behavior. We're going to solve this problem because the incentives are going to be there for people to change their behavior. They're going to want to change their behavior because there's a positive incentive for them to do that. That's one of the D's now. So we see we move away from denial, but we've got deflection, we've got division. We see that on social media, getting climate advocates fighting with each other, arguing about their lifestyle choices, whether they're vegan, whether they fly, these sorts of things. If they can get sort of create division within the sort of community of climate advocates, then it's sort of a divide and conquer strategy to prevent the climate community from speaking with a united voice, demanding action. We see delay is another D word. We'll solve this problem down the road. We'll invent new technology in the future. Trust us. So let us continue to extract and sell fossil fuels now, because we'll come up with a solution down the road. Delay tactic. But perhaps most significant, most pernicious of all, ironically, is doomism or despair. If they can come to convince us that it's too late to do anything about the problem, and you sort of alluded to that earlier in our conversation, then, if we can't do anything about it, then why bother? And again, they don't care about the path we take. They just care about the destination. So whether it's because of denial or it's because of doomism, you just think it's impossible, we can't solve this problem, it still leads us down this, to inaction. It sort of moves us off of the front lines onto the sidelines, which is where they want us. And so this new book was my opportunity to get back to the science, because I was seeing so much of this doomism on the part of people who would otherwise be pushing for climate action. Environmentalists, progressives, people who care about climate, who want to do something, but they've become convinced it's too late, that we can't do anything. So this book was really, I was inspired to write this book to address that, because so much of that doomism actually comes, ironically, from misrepresentations of the science. Just like climate deniers misrepresent the science, they misportray the science in an effort to discredit the science of climate change. You also have doomers who will, for example, say, well, look, there was this episode in the deep geological past where there was all of this methane that was trapped in the permafrost, and it was suddenly released into the atmosphere, and that led to runaway warming, and that's what's happening now. We can see it in the Arctic. It's too late. We're all going to be extinct. It's too late to do anything.
It's just part of nature.
Yeah, and I was seeing this weaponization of misrepresentation of the science of the very field that I sort of started in, which was paleoclimate, the study of past climate. I was seeing that science misrepresented, not to promote an agenda of denial, but to promote an agenda of doomism, which is just as problematic. And so here, what I've done is I've sort of returned to my roots. Let's look at the climate record. Let's start all the way at the beginning, when Earth was formed 4.5 billion years ago. And let's look at all of the major episodes that happened in the past and see what they tell us about how resilient versus fragile our planet is. At times, our planet can be fragile to insults, be they natural insults like an asteroid impact that happened and killed the dinosaurs 65 million years ago, or the human insult of increasing carbon pollution today. So the planet, in some respects, it can behave as if it's fragile under a very large impact, be it natural or human. But there are also examples, when you look at the paleoclimate record, that there's a certain amount of resilience in the climate system, that there's stabilizing feedback mechanisms that sort of return us to where we're supposed to be when we stop the insult, when we stop hitting the climate system with whatever that impact is. And so it's really, this book is about looking at the lessons from Earth's past, starting all the way 4.5 billion years ago, and seeing what they tell us about, how fragile and how resilient our climate system is. And in the end, when we take all of that evidence together, it underscores that same message that I was talking about before, that message of urgency. Yes, we have a problem and it's getting worse the more we pollute, but agency, that it is not too late to prevent the worst consequences of climate change. The paleoclimate record tells us that, and I wanted to tell that story to people because I think it's an important message at this particular juncture.
Right. Interesting. I just think of, denial and the doomism, like you talked about, we'll end up like the dinosaurs with this denial and doom and gloom philosophy. I mean, it just seems to be like equating fossil fuels with the dinosaurs. I think that's something that we could really hit people over the head with in terms of.
Do we have a few minutes to talk about that?
Yeah, yes, we do.
I'm glad you asked about that, because this was one of the things I had fun talking about. And I don't know, I get the sense that maybe you're the same basic generation that I am. And so do you, maybe you remember the group, The Police?
Sure.
Yeah. And back in the 1980s, there was an album, Synchronicity, and it had this was in the mid 1980s, sort of in the heart of the Cold War, the nuclear escalation between Russia and the US during sort of the Reagan era. And it was also shortly after the discovery of the KT collision. It was 1980. Alvarez and Alvarez of Berkeley actually demonstrated that basically the dinosaurs had been killed off by the effects of this asteroid collision with Earth that generated a huge global dust storm that actually cooled off the planet and basically killed off every organism larger than a dog, with a few exceptions. And so there's this amazing sort of synchronicity, if you will, the title of that album, between that discovery that was made around 1980 and the Cold War and the escalation, the nuclear escalation and the threat of global thermonuclear war. And here we had Carl Sagan, a great hero of mine. I talk about him quite a bit in the book. Who was one of the first sort of great popularizers of science. I sort of grew up watching Carl Sagan, the PBS series Cosmos, is part of what got me excited in science as I was a young child. And Sagan was talking about the threat of nuclear winter, that a global thermonuclear war would basically do what happened to the dinosaurs. And interestingly, a year before Sagan started to popularize that, so the public was really not aware of that connection, but the Police were writing the songs for their next album, Synchronicity. And one of those songs, Walking in Your Footsteps, if you listen to the lyrics, hey, mighty brontosaurus, Don't you have a lesson for us? When you listen to those lyrics, it's about exactly what we're talking about here. And it was prescient because Sting or Gordon Sumner, the police at the time, wouldn't have been aware of nuclear winter. That wasn't really popularized until about a year and a half later. So they were thinking more of just the destruction of these nuclear warheads. But in fact, the connection was far deeper than even they realized when they wrote that song, because it literally was the very same threat, nuclear winter, that killed off the dinosaurs. A natural nuclear winter in that case.
So there was a true synchronicity. And
anyway, synchronicity is about these causally disconnected and yet somehow related concepts, and that's what we have here.
Amazing. So let's not end up like the dinosaurs and continue with our fossil fuel ways. And please, when is our Fragile Moment coming out? It's coming out soon.
It's coming out this September.
This September
26, I believe. Yep.
September 26, our Fragile Moment is coming out. This is going to be very fascinating. Thanks. And this has been a very fascinating talk. I hopefully we have you again in some capacity when our Matern comes back.
Sure thing. We'd be happy to come back.
Yeah, and we are around the same generation too, which is exciting. So
very cool.
Watch for our Fragile Moment. We've had on Professor Michael Mann, and this has been very, very interesting. And I feel like there's a lot more to be discussed. So you're listening to A Climate Change with Matt Matern. It has been a terrific, terrific segment. And please, again, check out our Fragile Moment coming out September 26th by Michael Mann. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Harry. It's been great talking with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.